So we relate. Whether it's the BCers with their coastal old-growth temperate rainforests, the people in Alberta with their Rockies, the prairies in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, the Great Lakes of Ontario, the sugar maple forests, the beech forests of Quebec and down into Nova Scotia, or the barrens and the boreal forests of Newfoundland and northern Canada. We are molded and related to our environment, and we become really part of that environment. And so nature then becomes redemptive in some way. You know, the Swiss have their mountains, and the Germans have their forests, and the Dutch have their flat marshlands. And look how we market our country. It's supernatural BC. We market the icebergs and the whales of Newfoundland and Grossmore National Park. That's how we define ourselves nationally and provincially. Steve Fleming said to me that the national parks are one of the great icons of Canada. This is how Canada will market itself to the rest of the world. So we define ourselves by our natural environment. I remember I was up in Grossmore a few days ago being interviewed for trying to put together a show about people who've been affected by the park and trying to do an audio show for the Discovery Centre. And after I went over to Steve Fleming's bird banding station there in the park, and I was really fascinated. They had collected many birds that morning in the mist nets, and they were measuring the birds, and a lot of tourists would come by. And Steve would ask the tourists if they would like to let the birds go. So he'd put the birds into their hand, and it was amazing to see the glee in these adults, 40 and 50 and 60 years old. They just didn't want to do it. They were just gleeful and asking, can we do it, like a bunch of kindergarten students. You know, they just wanted to get a bird in the hand so they could let it go. And it really impressed me how these men and women of a certain advanced age wanted to relate somehow. They just wanted to touch and to reach out and to touch and to hold these birds. And is that not a concern? Maybe that's the basis for our concern today for biodiversity, which is really a major area of research and concern in natural sciences. And we're concerned about the great extinction spasm that we're now bringing about through our own human activity. And that reminds me, when I go back and think about Genesis, most people concentrate on the first two chapters of Genesis, but it's also good to go to the flood, into the 11th chapter. After the flood, it's probably not wise to look for the ark because you'll never find it, but after the flood, because it's beautiful poetic language, it was written for another reason. When God asked Noah and his family to build an ark so they would be saved from the rain, God did not simply ask Noah to come on with his family. You know the story. He said, bring on every single animal on the planet, male and female, so that they may reproduce after the flood. And this is what God said to Noah after the flood subsided. He said, or she said, or God said. There is no gender in God. God said, I am now establishing my covenant with you and your descendants to come, and with every living creature that was with you, birds, cattle, and every wild animal with you, everything that came out of the ark, every living being on earth. Never again, he said, or God said, shall there be a flood. And this is the sign which I now make between you and every living creature with you for all ages to come. I now set my bow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and my earth. When the bow is in the clouds, I shall see it and call to mind the eternal covenant between God and every living creature on earth, that is, all living things. So the ark story, the ark myth, is a foundational myth in our sacred stories. It's there. And the writer who wrote this about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, they had a sense that the relationship between the divine and between all and creation, it's not just between humans and God, as we often think, but it's the entire totality of relationships. And so everything went on the ark because God said, I make my relationship, I make my covenant, my bond of love between you and every living creature. When I was ordained 6 years ago, I put out a small a little mass card, for the fan club, a little thing you could give. And I used a quote from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He was quite a feisty saint in about the 1200s in Italy. I think it was Italy or France. And Saint Bernard said once, he used to spend a lot of time in the fields, and he was a monk. And he said one day, one of his letters to another monk, he said, I had discovered, he said, that you will find far more in the forests than you will in books. Trees and stones will teach you that which you cannot learn from any master. And so I've always used this quote and put it on my little mass card. And so the monks, when they built their monasteries, the monks went off to the desert. The Benedictines went to the mountains, Monte Cassino, that the Germans took over in Italy, the famous Benedictine monk monastery during the war. The Cistercians, another religious community, went to the valleys. So they went to these desert places, they went to these places out away because they knew that there they would have, in silence, they would have a much better chance of relating to who they were. That they would be able to save their soul and try to save the world in and through the relationship with the natural world. And so they left the cities and they went into the countryside, into the forests and into the mountains. So we relate, we're not just connected to nature, somehow we relate to nature. Husband and wife are not simply connected to each other, but they relate to each other. We are not simply connected to nature, we somehow relate. And finally, the third dimension of a spirituality of nature is what I call a transformational dimension. And I'd like to finish with a story. I don't know if I've related it before. When you should relate to that wasp, not to. No. But I'm sorry. When I was young and growing up in Mount Pearl, we used to have a small brook not far from the house. I used to call it Bubbling Brook because of the way it just bubbled across things. And we'd go to Sunday Mass Sunday morning early, 8:30. And then after Mass, I would go and take my fishing pole, and go up to the brook. And I'd always catch 2 to 3 nice pan-sized trout, and I would bring back home, and we'd have bacon and eggs and trout for Sunday breakfast. It was a very kind of a traditional thing in my home. And one day, I went back to this brook, and it was no longer there. A few days before, a bulldozer had come down and channeled the entire brook. It was behind a row of future housing development. So someone had come down in their own right mind and had bladed out the entire stream. And so it no longer existed for me. And I must say, I still remember when I saw that bulldozed stream, just a great sense of anger and a real deep sense of loss that this would no longer be there. That something that I had loved and cherished for many years was now no longer there. And I sometimes think, for me anyway, this is almost symptomatic of what I see and what many of you see in today's world. Things that we cherish, things that we hope for and long for, are no longer there. They've been logged, they've been fished, they've been mined, and they've been polluted. And I must say, I continue to lament very deeply the loss of the North Atlantic cod fishery. And I wonder about the imminent loss of the North Atlantic shrimp and crab fishery. And I have great worries about the sustainability of our forests and what we are presently doing today. So I lament at the same time a great sense of the forces at work in the world that continue to see nature as a stockpile of resources ready for our use. And in the process, the poor and the disenfranchised people of the world suffer more and more. Environmental concerns in North America often, they do relate to the poor. But my fellow brother Jesuits who work around the world, they know quite well that the poor are the first to suffer environmental destruction in today's world, because they have no voice and they have no support. But when I went back to that brook a few years later, a number of years later actually, we had since moved from that street, and I went back and the brook still flowed through. But the entire brook had been transformed into a sea of phlox, blue phlox, and it was beautiful. You know, there was a real sense of beauty. I didn't know if the trout were there anymore. I couldn't fish anymore. It was too shallow. But somehow, nature had transformed itself into a sea of beauty, different than what it was before, but still beautiful. And I would like to think that any spirituality of nature has to be transformational, that in us we do not accept the status quo as the final word. That the modern paradigms or any ideology that comes on the scene, a spirituality that's true and authentic will never accept that as the final word in things. Because in Christian terms, we always seek the kingdom of God. And I know when you pray the Our Father, you know, Thy kingdom come, recognizing that it has not yet been fulfilled. That I'm always hoping that there will no more tears will be shed. I'm always hoping that all will have enough to eat, that all could gather without fear of being arrested or imprisoned. So we are hoping for transformation in the entire world. And a true spirituality has to address that. It has to never accept the status quo, because that is never the kingdom, that is never the final word. Never accept it, but move ahead with hope and with courage. So I would hope that you too, in your work and in your striving, in your writing and in your speaking and in your conversations, would too become witnesses to the world. Even though it may seem that your voice is never heard, even though you may think that you're beating your head against a stone wall. But that's the nature of a true spirituality that seeks to transform that which is not yet transformed. And so I think that in the end, a spirituality of nature must ultimately be a subversive spirituality. It has to recognize that there is more to the situation. There is more that we hope for and more that we long for. So nature as creation, nature as relational, nature as sacramental, nature revealing more than what we can see with our eyes necessarily, and a spirituality that's transformational. So those are kind of the four visions that I would have for a spirituality that engages the world. And each of us, with our own tradition, our own background, will engage it in different ways. But I think those four elements can be a hope or a sense of reflection for how we want to engage the world and how we want to witness for the beauty of the earth and for, as Revelation says, for a new heaven and a new earth. Thank you very much.